I've never wanted to write autobiographical work. I'll share with you, I think this is a sort of more intimate setting where I can share with you quite honestly what I think about things. I don't think writers should be taken too seriously. Their work should be taken seriously. And I didn't want to contribute to the biographical approach. He wrote this because his aunt, etc., etc., etc. You can make up a story on your own. Because while it is true that our lives impinge upon what we write, we transcend it if we're successful as a writer. And to bring it down to that level again, I think, reduces its meaning, the compass of its meaning. And I wrote Coming to Terms with a Child only when 3 weeks after my 80th birthday, my youngest daughter gave birth to a grandson, Bennett. And when I looked at that lump they called Bennett, I thought, I owe you an explanation. And that's why I wrote Coming to Terms with a Child. It is a poem about my experience as a child in Nazi Germany. I think you're quite correct that you can see in it why I left Germany. If you're going to ask me questions about that, I'm going to answer them, but I'm not going to voluntarily enlarge upon it because it's not really relevant to poetry or my poetry, although I can see, having lived through war as a child, why I'm forever looking at the places where ugly things are happening in the world. I would like to talk to you today about Seasons of Blood. It's a long poem in more ways than one. It's only half finished, I think. I do not know whether I should live to finish it. It now has 165 pages. It would take approximately 12 hours to read, so I won't read it to you. It came to me. Poetry, you know, people who don't write poetry, or some people who do write what they think is poetry, think that you sit down and you have an idea and you're going to work on it and you make it a poem. Well, that's not the way it works for me. Poems usually come to me and tell me what to do. This particular poem started quite innocuously. I was working at the time on the translation of Hedda Gabler, Ibsen's play. A friend of mine, I write for the theatre too, a friend of mine said, I want you to do a new translation of Hedda Gabler, at any rate. So for Montreal Theatre, I did it. In the middle of it, I was living at the time in the bush. This is another story I could talk about at length, and which I have written about, not autobiographically, but what it's like pioneering in Canada. I bought 50 hectare or 100 acres of bush. There was no house on it. I built the house with my own hands, a path, dug a pond big enough for a canoe. That was a life story in itself. And I was working there. Well, I put up 6 buildings. One was the main, well, it was supposed to be my working studio, but that was the time when another woman came into my life, and as you know, that changes things. So it became a residence, and I had to build it somewhat larger, but then I built a studio for me, or study for me. I have to say study because I built a studio for my wife, who's a painter, on opposite sides of the house, so that we will not interfere with each other. And there I sat and worked on Hedda Gabler. And one morning I come into my study, and now you'll probably think that I'm mad, and if you do, you're probably right too, but that's another story. I have this sense of a presence in the room. Couldn't see anything physical, but something was there bugging me. I sat down to work on whatever it was, Act 2, of Hedda Gabler, and this presence was interfering, looking over my shoulder, was bothering me. And I didn't know quite what was going on. I cursed. If you had been a squirrel sitting in the corner of my study, you would have wondered if I had lost my mind. I said, leave me in peace. I've got to get this done. Per has just called. He wants the text. I can't bother with you. Quite literally, this went on over some days, 3 days, and I gave in. I said, okay, we'll make a pact. I will write down whatever it is I'm supposed to write down, and then you leave me in peace, and I finish and then I go back after I've done with Hedda Gabler. This is literally what happened. Little did I know that this was going to be something that would occupy the rest of my life. I've been working at, this is the result of about 30 years, and you will forgive me if I correct you, I did not write about countries that I visited. I went to countries because the poem demanded that I go there. I had a section on Africa. How could I write about Africa without going there? I have to go, I have to taste the air, I have to touch the soil, I have to hear, I have to smell. I went to Japan. I didn't go to Japan to write about Japan. I went to Japan because I was writing about Japan. You know what I mean? It wasn't like a cook. I have a friend, I will name him, a Canadian poet who I call the sort of cook's tour poet. He's forever going to places, and then we get poems from Indonesia or from China and so forth. That's not the way it works. I went there because I needed to get information. I didn't understand at the time what was happening. I simply, when I write, as I said yesterday, I don't write because I have some wisdom to share, but I write because I'm ignorant, and in writing I can sort out my thinking. At the end of something, I've learned something in the writing process. The writing process is very much parallel to the reading process. You open the book, you haven't got a clue. When I start my first line, I haven't got a clue. When you finish, well, you may have a clue. I have a clue. Something that the poem teaches me. And this poem, I had no idea where it was taking me, even when I was halfway through it. It simply grew organically, made its demands, or that I had choices. I brought to bear my past experience, my training, my reading, my emotions, everything. But I wasn't in the driver's seat, ever. I don't know if you understand that. It's sometimes difficult because, and it may be that this is not the same for every writer. Nothing is ever the same for everybody. We make that mistake that we look at each other and say, oh, this is a girl and this is a boy, so therefore he will do this and she will do that. It isn't like that, as I hope you have found out. So, but I want to make this as informal as possible, so if you feel like questioning me about anything, please do. What I would propose to do, since I understand from Professor Küster that what you are interested in is the long poem, of course one of the questions is, why does one write a long poem? I've just given you an explanation that I sort of, somebody put a pistol to my head, I know who it was, and I'm still writing it. It has to do, of course, I've reflected on why it's not the only long poem I write. My wife has gradually become accustomed to my coming in with a little poem, 14 lines perhaps, and so on, and oh good. She has translated some of my work, by the way. She's a superb translator into French, and so she's happy. But she knows now not to trust that moment before the storm, because 3 days later I'll come back, oh, I've got to make some changes. And these changes keep on growing and growing and growing, and she never translates anything now until it's in print, because then she's sure I won't be rewriting it. So why do I write like this? The best answer I can give you is that for me, everything in the world is connected. And I mean everything. I could start talking about your nose, your hair, that windmill there, and unfold the universe. Because it's all connected. You just have to look closely. And then it comes, and it attaches to something else, and something else, and something else, and something else. And it's endless. You can't catch it even in a poem. If I had to rewrite this poem, it would be different altogether. Longer, probably. Other things have occurred to me that I could have introduced into it. So that's one thing I would say generally about the long poem. It has something to do with the kind of mind that is at work. And mine is that sort of encyclopedic or whatever. In some ways I consider myself a Renaissance man, without meaning that to be a compliment, simply a description. That is to say, I am interested in everything. There's nothing that does not interest me except making money. I don't know why I have a gap there in my mind. But everything else is fascinating, endlessly fascinating to me. And I'm sorry that I'm at the end of my life, more or less, and don't have a chance to start anew. I'd like to go and study, astrophysics, or become a surgeon. All these things open wonderful windows onto the mystery that surrounds us and of which we are a part. So this sense of, I hate to use the word mystical because it tends to become religious. I don't know anything about it. When it comes to religion, I am a Taoist. I don't know whether you know the Taoist. It's a branch of Buddhism. The Buddhist is a religion without God, which is an interesting phenomenon. But the Taoist says, in essence, in matters metaphysical, if it can be put into words, it's false. And that begins and ends my discussion of religion. But it is a mystical sense in the sense in which medieval mystics used to think of it, of oneness of the universe. I think there is an extraordinary interconnectedness among all things. And I think there are parallel structures throughout the universe. I think as we are talking here, I imagine there will be a room very different from this, with creatures very different, except they too have intelligence. Because life, to me, will inevitably produce intelligence. And life will spring up when the conditions are right. And given that there are 100 billion galaxies with 100 billion stars each, that's the minimum we have recently discovered. There may be many more than that. We don't know the circumference of the universe. There are millions of stars on which there is life. Planets, of course, around stars, to be precise. Just a matter of how close they are and that the conditions are right. And once that happens, that the conditions are right, that the first two cells bind together and discover it's better for two cells to survive than one, especially when they do different things, then you're on your own. And you end up where we are now, with 100 trillion cells cooperating, because all you are really is a bunch of microbes connected, having in some ways been induced to cooperate and to produce you for a while. Then they go on to work somewhere else. So I find this endlessly fascinating, and I cannot look at anything without very quickly moving on, as you have seen, even talking about it. I'm already talking about the universe, and I should be reading from this poem. And I shall. So I hope you will interrupt me and bring me back down to earth. What I thought I would do is to start with, because there are other questions about long poems. What holds them together? What makes them a long poem? I've had friends to suggest to me, I have a publishing problem. Because for a magazine to publish a poem of mine, they have to give me the whole issue. They don't want to do that. They want to publish 40 poets, each with a short one, and not one, half or two issues given to me. Why don't you break them up? Well, I can see that there are different sections. You hear different voices. In this poem, for instance, you have 4 distinct voices, because the poem explores the human condition on these levels. The first is the order of nature. The nature that we seem to forget most of the time, but of which we are a part, of which we depend. In Canada, living in the bush, I couldn't forget nature. All I would see out of the window, I remember a critic coming to interview me for the CBC one day, and suddenly he said to me, "Henry, now I know where all your imagery comes from." I was flabbergasted. I said, what do you mean? I said, "Well, look out there, the window of your study. That's what you see." Oh, I said, "Yeah, it's true." I was kind of surprised. Then I said, "Oh, it's natural, isn't it?" I mean, anyway, so there is the order of physical nature that surrounds us, on which the poem, and that's what I want to do. I want to read you the opening of the poems of each of the section, where you see the poet sitting. I'm a morning man, you can tell that too, because it's always morning light with which I start. And from there, I move outward. What is the next level? Well, call it historical, call it political, call it cultural. It is what we have made of this nature that gave birth to us and death. All right, so the second is political, if you like. The third level is science. How do we now see the world out there? I see those trees, I can even identify the species of tree, I can see the clouds, I know where the wind is coming from, 1,000 things. And yet I also know that this is an illusion, that I produce all this in my head and you with me, because you're made basically of the same stuff as I am. But in actual fact, these are all things made of molecules, and we know the molecules are made of atoms, and we used to think that was the end of the story, but it isn't. We now know about subatomic particles and their behavior. We have wonderful theories, quantum theory, to deal with that. Very disturbing theories, because they're totally counterintuitive. That is one of the problems in science today between Einstein's relativity and quantum theory, because both there is an enormous amount of evidence to suggest that both these theories are correct. But unfortunately, both of these theories cannot be correct in the same world. So now we're looking for what they call a theory of everything, a unified theory that somehow reconciles these contradictions. It's endlessly fascinating, as you can see. I'm off again. Science. I have actually a book coming out. Did you print any of the copies of that flyer for Fugitive Horizons? Oh, no, never mind. Yet. No, you haven't. I have a book coming out later this year of poems called Fugitive Horizons. It's a cycle of 70 plus poems about looking at the world through the eyes of a modern scientist. But that's already prefigured in here. Fugitive Horizons plays with it on a different level. So here you have 3 levels, so to repeat: nature, politics, history, whatever, science. The 4th level is the individual mind, you moving through this matrix and changing it. As we know, disturbing as that may be, from quantum theory, from the behavior of subatomic particles, looking at things changes their behavior. This is at a very elementary level, not my looking at a pretty girl who might then respond with disgust, or the other way around, they look at me. At any rate, looking here is different. It's a scientifically demonstrable You have all read about Schrödinger's cat. Well, maybe you haven't. If you have, you know what the dilemma is. The point I want to make about science is that it reveals to us a world that does not correspond to what we usually think it is. And we have to learn to live with that. I think that I see in a larger, and I think that's something I'm discovering through these poems, I see mankind as a single body, so to speak, moving through the stages of life. And I think humanity has now reached its puberty. That is a very critical stage in which many people, in which suicide is quite common. Because what puberty means is finally having to face reality and go on. And having to face reality in science means to accept that we are nothing, we are nobody, our lives have no sense, the universe makes no sense, period. And they say, well, what are we going to do now? And no, that's what we're going to have to find out. We're going to have to construct a ground on which we can move on in spite of that, because those are the facts. At least that's how I see the crisis of our time. It's come about because a lot of people, of course, understandably, most of you in psychology will know fight and flight, turn away. You know, like a child, you see something you don't like, it's gone. Close my eyes, it's gone. You open your eyes, it's there, of course. So that, in a sense, is, I've discovered, probably what drives me on with this poem, to find a way, a viable road into the future. It involves, among other things, finding an ethical ground. If nothing makes any sense, and it doesn't matter what I do, so why should I do anything? Why shouldn't I kill or rape or drown myself, whatever? It all doesn't make any difference, and in a sense it doesn't. But I think it does. And I'm trying to find a way that goes beyond sort of conventional explanations, which I think have lost their force for most people. That's what religions were about, organized religions. They gave you the answer. But I think that the number of people who believe in those answers is diminishing and will go to zero at one point, at some point. Okay, now you have a basic idea of what a long poem might be about. And now I'm going to stop chattering, and I'll read you the opening of, there are 6 sections that I had planned none. I wrote one, and then it forced me to write another. I think I now know what was driving me, what was standing in that corner was my conscience. But I didn't know that, and I haven't discovered, it took me 20 years to discover that. I will start with the first one, and I'll give you a few explanations, because I can't read you everything. In fact, I should watch it. What time do I have to shut up?
You have 60 more minutes.
60 minutes. And please, once again, speak up. I like to be interrupted, not in the middle of a reading. Ask you to give me permission to finish a section that I want to read, but in between, I mean, this is your chance. I don't think I'll be back in Marburg. Oh, I said that last year. So, anyway, feel free, as I always tell students, there are no stupid questions, there are only stupid answers. So I'm on the firing line, so to speak. I'll give you a chance. Yes?
And everything you just said just refers to your book Seasons of Blood, or in general to all long poems? Yep.
No, it is Seasons of Blood.
Okay.
One is always tempted, and I do it all the time, to make more general statements. But as soon as I'm challenged, I'm like a snail. You touch it and pull it back into its house. Because I'm not sure that I know what I'm talking about. Because I'm not sure what kind of a world I live in. I try desperately. I've read copiously in all the sciences, in literature. I'm an avid reader, but I have to say my feeling is that of a sort of process that I can only describe as Socratic irony. I'm coming closer and closer to knowing that I know nothing. So I'm cautious about generalizations. Apply what I say to myself and to this poem, and we'll leave it there. But it was a good question. Any other questions? No? So I'll read you the opening, which is literally embodies my situation. I had this studio that I built in the bush, no telephone, nothing. I was in another world. Closed the door, that was it. Only trees and the occasional deer or the raccoon or the cardinal that came to talk to me, not from the Church of Rome. It's a bird I'm talking about. All right. The Ides of March. Beware. Mornings are brutal now, as they shatter the illusion of night with the fierceness that stabs the eye. The sky leaps into the brain. We cannot escape spring. An arrow of wild geese shrieks northward in slow motion, piercing our dreams, quick with the point of their cries. We hear the warning. We smell the body odors of our beloved earth. We know the morning of another season has come, and that we cannot escape spring. Spruce and fir throws quills of light, the crusted snow cracks, and with its hard bristles the west wind begins to sweep up winter's shards. Slowly this well-tempered planet tilts against the sun. 100 million years ago, the cortex began to stir in obscure convolutions between hearing and smelling. A flesh cauliflower sprouting towards, pressing the skull, swelling, reaching for. The light is coming. We cannot escape. Though more than half of us is still in the dark. A scream. Listen. Was that the last cry of 6-year-old Rosita, beheaded with a machete after they hacked off her feet in the Redeemer's land? Or was it her mother as they flayed her thighs? Or her father as they punctured his eyes? El Salvador screamed and no one listened at the equinox of blood, when military forces violated all the laws of life and liberty. It took 1 billion springs to grow. The power the blind have over the blind is fearful. Money cannot endure innocence. Cry, my beloved. Rosita's eyes are rigid now. I leave it at that for the opening. You can see what's happening here. The poet is sitting there having impressions from nature invade him, impinge upon him. He is terrified because he is somehow aware that it's not good to have the full light, because he hears voices. And in the voices of nature and in the images of nature, he suddenly hears the scream of a young girl, Rosita. She pops up in the whole poem. I had read about her in the newspaper. It's based on a true story of this kid who was chopped up by the military, you know, the kind of people in the Latin American countries, armed and financed by the American CIA in El Salvador. And that must have had such a profound impact on me at some very deep level of my conscience that it left me, I needed to write about it, but I didn't know that until I began to write it. So that's how I move from nature into what we have made of nature. And I warn you, if you go on to read the poem, as I hope, of course, you will, read the text, because what I do here is at best whet your appetite. The poem, any poem, will yield itself only in an intimate exchange between you and the text, when you shut out everything else and you talk to each other. Unless you're willing to do that, you will get nothing out of the poem. Just a way of whiling away time and entertainment. An oddball from Canada who comes here with his bacteria. All right, I'll read you the second. So that turned into a poem about El Salvador. There's a lot in the poem about what happened there. All my poetry, that's interesting, you will discover, but it's been pointed out to me, I wasn't aware of it myself, ends on an upbeat note. Most of my poems descend into hell at some point, but they also climb out. There seems to be some, and I think it reflects my attitude. I think I'm ultimately an optimist, though most people think I'm a pessimist, because I tell them what's happening out there and they don't want to know that. But I think unless you know what's happening there, you're not going to be able to deal with it. It will deal with you. So, sorry?
Yeah, because we talked about this, the beginning of this poem last week in class, and we had talked about it, and the week before we had talked about the wasteland.
Right.
And so, at least some of us were struck, or at least their prof told them, that there was a kind of allusion to April is the cruelest month, and that kind of we cannot escape spring kind of goes into the same direction that T.S. Eliot is talking about when he is alluding to Chaucer, etc. So there is a whole intertextual empire of earlier texts in there.
It's absolutely correct. In my academic profession, I was a medievalist and a modernist. And Chaucer's "One that April with its shoreless sote, the drochte of Marcha pierced to the rote, and Zephyrus eke with its sweet breath, inspired hath in every holt and heath the tender croppers," and so forth. Of course, it's in my mind. But you see, in Chaucer, April is the sweet, April with sweet rains. For Eliot, April is the cruelest month. Why? Because April is spring. And spring means the waking up of the mind. And the waking up of the modern mind, of the man who has lost his soul, is a terrifying experience. Yes, I link myself clearly to that tradition. Absolutely. So that was a good discussion. Pity I wasn't here. I mean, quietly here. Yes, that's there are this poems too have a dramatic structure. You try to draw in the reader, and you try to draw them in without them knowing where they're going, And they are wonderful poems. One of my favorite love poems, I don't know whether you know it, just begins, "As I walked out one evening, walking down Bristol Street, the crowds upon the pavement were fields of harvest wheat, and down by the brimming river I heard a lover sing under an arch of the railway. Love has no ending. I love you, dear. I love you till Africa and China meet," etc., etc. The river jumps over the mountain and the salmon sing in the street. I love you till the ocean is folded and hung up to dry, and the 7 stars go squawking like geese about the sky. A wonderful poem. It just takes you in, and all of a sudden the poem says, "But all the clocks in the city began to whir and chime, you cannot master, oh, what's the line? You cannot conquer time. In the burrows of the nightmare where justice naked is, time watches from the shadows and coughs when you kiss, and so forth. It's a lovely poem, it's a wonderful poem, capturing the contradictoriness, the paradox of living, that on the one hand there's this lover singing, and yet at the same time the clocks chime and remind him it will all pass. Isn't that the source of so much of our drama, of our joys and of our suffering? Anyway, your point is well taken. I'll read you the second one that came after. Well, you saw that it was called The Ides of March. That also links to something, I hope, in your mind. But the March also suggests a month of the year, a season, and it was natural that the next one would be April. And April links, in my mind, to fools. I came to Canada on April 1st, 1951, appropriate day, I think, I thought. And April Fools continues, where April is of course still, we're not in summer yet. In fact, this year, I don't know when we're going to get summer. I'll read, did you read this at the beginning of this too?
No.
No. Again, watch the poet being dragged, so to speak, and this is the point I want to make. When I'm alone in my study and close the doors and write,